Climate change is often thought of like a ticking time bomb, something that if not fixed by 2030, 2040, or 2050 will have massive worldwide damage. But unfortunately, climate change is having impacts today and has been having impacts for the last 20 years. If you look at this infographic from intelligentliving.co, we can see that regions, specifically in and around the Caribbean, are most at risk for climate change related damage. Good morning, my name is Ivan Gopaninko, and today we'll be discussing climate change, developed nations, and natural disasters. Specifically, I set out to answer the research question, how have carbon emissions from developed nations impacted the severity of natural disasters within the Caribbean over the past 20 years? Through careful analysis, I've found that as developed nations continually emit carbon, they increase the average global temperatures. This increase then in turn strengthens natural disasters, making sure that when they hit the Caribbean nations, they cause massive economic damage and cause huge death tolls. Specifically, in today's presentation, we'll do three things. First, will climate change our knowledge as to how much carbon is in the atmosphere? Next, we'll turn up the heat by analyzing how carbon causes natural disasters, before finally putting on ice the myth that natural disasters are nothing to worry about. Let's begin by analyzing carbon in the atmosphere. According to the United States National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, there's currently over 412 parts per million of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which represents a 47% increase since the beginning of the industrial era. If we look at this infographic from the World Bank, it shows you that 6 of the 7 top emitters, that being United States, Canada, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, and Germany, are all wealthy, developed nations. That shows you where carbon dioxide is coming from. And this CO2 in the atmosphere then massively increases global temperatures. If you look at this infographic, we can see that as CO2 concentration increases over time, so too does the global annual temperature. This happens because CO2 weakens the ozone layer, allowing more heat from the sun to get to the Earth's surface and heat up the air around us. That means that certain natural disasters are more likely to form. Specifically, we can see that hydrological and meteorological events like hurricanes and floods have increased greatly over time as CO2 concentration increases. Although the increase is small, there is still a reasonable increase in geophysical events like earthquakes as climate change and global warming have increased. Unfortunately, these natural disasters are striking in areas that simply aren't ready to deal with them. We can understand this by analyzing the differences between Caribbean and developed nations' responses to natural disasters. For example, we'll look at the 2019 flooding. In Miami, Florida, the United States government gave hundreds of millions of dollars to create the necessary infrastructure to make sure that after the disasters hit, people there could still get access to food, water, and shelter, and to minimize the risk of flooding actually causing damage. In Haitian nations, the same funding simply wasn't available, meaning that people had to personally stockpile goods or get lucky in order to survive. This is incredibly problematic when we realize that the disaster frequency is 5 times higher in the Caribbean nations compared to other nations worldwide. And because of this, Caribbean nations lose almost 2.5% of their annual GDP to natural disasters. But let's analyze this GDP loss further, and we'll see that this doesn't actually happen in slow trickled events over time. Instead, this happens in a few major events. Specifically, in the last 2 decades, we can look at Hurricanes Maria, Sandy, and Irma, which, according to this infographic, caused over $60 billion of damage each. In one moment, a Caribbean nation can lose more money than their entire annual GDP, meaning that they simply are losing businesses, infrastructure, communities, and homes in instants. This means that when the next natural disasters strike, they simply don't have the money necessary to provide and protect their citizens. This is one of the issues that's especially being increased by carbon emissions and by global warming. If we look at this infographic, we can see that storms, floods, and geophysical natural disasters like earthquakes cause the vast majority of economic damage. Specifically, these were the 3 natural disasters that were increasing over time with carbon emissions and global warming. In turn, this damage is caused very greatly in the Americas, of which the Caribbean is a part. So as natural disasters continue to strike, they continue to weaken Caribbean nations time and time again, removing their abilities to defend themselves from future disasters, which become stronger and stronger over time. this causes one major thing, which is death. If we look at this infographic as to where the highest per capita natural disaster fatalities are, we can see that Dominica, Honduras, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Dominican Republic, all nations in and around the Caribbean, make up 5 of the 10 regions with the highest per capita death rates from natural disasters. Specifically, the College Board provided stimulus, in their own words, resilience amongst Haitian survivors of the 2010 earthquake, shows that over 230,000 people died from just the 2010 earthquake alone. In one instant, a population equivalent to half the population of Wyoming disappeared and died in one instant. These natural disasters are becoming stronger and more frequent over time, which leads us to understand that something needs to be done before this cyclical economic damage and death continues to exist. Specifically, I propose that developed nations immediately and radically cut their emissions today. That means shutting down things like coal factories, shutting down policies that allow deforestation, and focusing more on sustainable building practices. Of course, even this solution isn't perfect, because we can't fix natural disasters that are happening today. The damage has already been done. Natural disasters have already increased in both magnitude and frequency, meaning that unless we curb emissions today, they will continue to get stronger. So in conclusion, as developed nations continue to emit carbon, they increase the average global temperature, leading to higher frequencies of earthquakes, hurricanes, and other natural disasters. This in turn causes massive cyclical economic damage, guaranteeing that Caribbean nations aren't ready for future disasters. Also, they cause massive death tolls, which should simply be considered unacceptable in today's society. These are my works cited. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
2 questions. First one, what information did you need that you weren't able to find or locate?
I was hoping to find some information specifically about how volcanic eruptions are becoming more common because of climate change. Unfortunately, I couldn't find that information, but it would have been very good for my presentation because volcanic eruptions are something that's pretty unique to Caribbean nations and not as well seen in most developed nations like in Europe and America.
All right, and explain the level of certainty you are of your solution.
I'm incredibly certain because I think that unless developed nations are to curb their emissions today or very close from now, it's just been proven that that global warming will continue to increase and more carbon will continue to get into the atmosphere. There's no evidence saying otherwise, and there's no conclusion from any reputable source that's saying that climate change won't continue to increase.